The town of Alderwood was an unassuming speck on the map, nestled in the shadow of endless, whispering pines. It was a quiet place, the kind of town where time seemed to forget to move forward, and the air carried an uneasy stillness. The locals had grown used to the peculiarities, the small, inexplicable things they couldn't quite name but felt in their bones. People avoided the woods after dark, spoke in hushed tones about the old well at the edge of town, and no one dared mention the peculiar fog that sometimes rolled in, even on the clearest of nights. It began on an ordinary evening. Eliza, a young woman new to Alderwood, moved into the crumbling house she'd inherited from a distant, never-met relative. The place was in poor condition, with peeling wallpaper and floorboards that groaned like a dying thing under her feet. Still, the price was unbeatable, and Eliza was desperate for a fresh start. Her first night was restless. She woke repeatedly to faint sounds, a scraping that seemed to come from beneath the floorboards, the muffled creak of footsteps in the hallway. Dismissing them as the natural quirks of an old house, she tried to sleep. But as dawn broke, she discovered something chilling. A wet, muddy trail leading from her bedroom door to the attic hatch in the ceiling. She hadn't opened the attic yet. Curiosity and dread gnawed at her as she pulled the rickety ladder down. The air up there was damp and smelled faintly of decay. Dust swirled in the weak beam of her flashlight as she climbed. The attic was mostly empty, save for a few broken chairs and a collection of old photos scattered across the floor. The images were strange. They depicted the house, but there were unfamiliar faces in every frame, staring at the camera with unnervingly blank expressions. Then she saw it. In the corner, partially hidden beneath a rotting blanket, was a large, ornate mirror. Its silver frame was intricately carved, depicting twisted, screaming faces interwoven with thorny vines. The surface of the glass was cloudy, but as she wiped it clean, her reflection came into view. At least, she thought it was her reflection. The face staring back was subtly wrong, the eyes a touch too wide, the mouth curved in a faint smirk she wasn't making. That night, the noises grew louder. The scraping was no longer beneath the floorboards. It was in the walls, closer, almost as if something were crawling just out of sight. She tried to ignore it, but when her bedroom door creaked open on its own, she froze. In the dim light, she saw a shadow move, something that didn't belong to her. Panicking, she ran into the hallway, only to find herself standing in front of the attic ladder, now inexplicably pulled down. A faint glow seeped from the attic above. Against her better judgment, she climbed. The mirror was there, but the reflection was no longer hers. The glass seemed to pulse, like it was breathing, and within its depths, she saw the attic as it should have been. Empty, dark, lifeless. But then a figure stepped into view. It was her, yet not her. The duplicate smiled, lifting a hand in a slow wave, and then it stepped out. Eliza stumbled back, but there was no escape. The attic hatch slammed shut, plunging her into darkness. The last thing she heard before her scream was swallowed by silence was the sound of footsteps descending the ladder. When the townsfolk noticed Eliza hadn't been seen for a few days, they didn't think much of it. People came and went in Alderwood all the time, usually without a word. But when her landlord arrived to check on the overdue rent, he found the house empty. The only thing left behind was an ornate mirror in the attic, its cloudy surface reflecting nothing at all. Over the years, new tenants would move in, and they would always find the mirror. They would try to move it, but it wouldn't budge, no matter how hard they tried. And in time, they too would disappear, leaving behind only the echoes of their footsteps and the faint, mocking laughter that seemed to come from the walls. The mirror always stayed. It was waiting. And in Alderwood, everyone knew better than to look too long into its depths.
Story number 2.
The village of Black Hollow had earned its name from the pitch-dark marsh that bordered its outskirts. It was a place of myths and whispered tales, where even the bravest dared not tread after sundown. The marsh was said to be alive, not in the natural way of reeds swaying or frogs croaking, but with something older and hungrier than any living thing. Jared, a traveling cartographer, thought nothing of the warnings when he arrived in Black Hollow. The villagers had always been superstitious, spinning tales to scare away outsiders, he thought. He was there for work to map the dense woods and the marshlands surrounding the village. Stay on the marked paths, the innkeeper warned him as he prepared to leave the next morning. If you hear voices, don't follow. And if you see lights, For the love of all things holy, don't look directly at them. Jared only chuckled, pocketing the crudely drawn map the man handed him. The day passed uneventfully. Jared marked his path, sketched trees and waterways, and noted the marsh's odd silence. There were no birds, no insects, only the soft squelch of mud beneath his boots and the occasional creak of shifting water. As dusk approached, a dense fog began to roll in, and Jared decided it was time to head back. He consulted the map and turned toward the village, but the path was gone. Where there had been solid ground, there was now an expanse of black water stretching endlessly in every direction. Panic tightened his chest as he turned in circles, searching for something familiar. That's when he saw the first light. It flickered faintly, like a lantern bobbing in the distance. Relieved, he called out, but the light didn't respond. Instead, it moved, sliding smoothly through the fog, beckoning him. He hesitated, remembering the innkeeper's warning. But the alternative, being lost in the marsh overnight, was worse. As he approached the light, another appeared, then another, forming a trail. They led him deeper into the marsh, where the air grew colder and the fog thicker. The lights seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat, drawing him forward. Soon the ground beneath his feet turned soft, and he sank ankle-deep into the muck. "Hello?" Jared called again, his voice shaking. The answer came, but it wasn't what he expected. A faint whisper rose around him, not from a single voice, but many, overlapping and indistinct. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was pleading, desperate. The whispers grew louder, pressing against his ears until they became a deafening roar. Then the lights vanished. Jared was plunged into darkness, so absolute it felt like a weight on his chest. He stumbled, falling to his knees in the cold mud. The whispers continued, now so close he could feel breath against his neck. Something moved in the dark, a slithering, wet sound that sent icy fear racing through his veins. He scrambled to his feet, but the mud clung to him, dragging him down. Panic consumed him as he thrashed, trying to free himself. Then he saw them, eyes, dozens of them, glowing faintly in the blackness. They hovered at the edge of his vision, too many to belong to a single creature. As he stared, frozen in terror, the eyes began to blink, one by one, in slow, deliberate unison. A voice emerged from the cacophony of whispers, low and guttural, cutting through the noise like a blade. "You shouldn't have come here." Jared screamed as the ground beneath him gave way, and he was swallowed by the marsh. Days later, the villagers found his belongings scattered at the edge of the marsh. His map was there, the ink smeared and waterlogged, but the path he had marked ended abruptly, leading straight into the black water. Some say the marsh claimed him, adding his soul to the countless others trapped within. On foggy nights, travelers report seeing lights in the distance, dancing just beyond reach, but no one dares follow. Because in Black Hollow, everyone knows, once the marsh takes you, it never lets go.
Story number 3.
The road to Foxglove Manor was rarely used, a narrow, twisting path bordered by ancient trees that seemed to lean inward, creating a tunnel of shadows. The manor itself had been abandoned for decades, its windows gaping like empty eye sockets, its roof sagging with the weight of time. Locals swore it was cursed, but curses didn't scare Henry. He was a contractor sent to survey the property for a wealthy client eager to restore the place. The sun was already setting when he arrived, casting the manor in deep orange hues that only highlighted its decay. As he stepped out of his truck, the air felt wrong, too still, too cold for a summer evening. Ignoring the prickle at the back of his neck, Henry grabbed his flashlight and tools, pushing the creaking front door open. The inside was worse than he expected. The air was thick with the scent of mildew, and the floorboards groaned under his weight. Cobwebs draped the walls like veils, and peeling wallpaper revealed strange, intricate patterns beneath. The patterns caught his attention, swirling symbols that seemed almost deliberate, like they'd been carved into the plaster. He set to work quickly, marking structural weaknesses and taking photos. The atmosphere grew heavier with every step, as though the house was watching him. Dismissing the thought, he climbed the grand staircase, his boots echoing loudly in the silence. At the top was a hallway lined with closed doors. One door at the far end was slightly ajar. A faint, flickering light spilled from the crack. "Hello?" Henry called, his voice unsteady. No answer. He edged closer, his flashlight trembling in his grip. The light inside the room wasn't natural. It pulsed, dimming and brightening in an erratic rhythm. Pushing the door open, he found an empty room save for a single chair in the center. On the chair sat an old mirror, its surface marred with black spots and grime. The light seemed to come from within the glass itself, swirling faintly like smoke trapped inside. As Henry stared, his reflection began to shift. It didn't mimic his movements, but instead stood still, watching him with a faint, unsettling smile. His breath caught as the reflection's eyes widened unnaturally, and it raised a hand, though he hadn't moved. Then it spoke. Leave. The word was muffled, like hearing a voice underwater, but it was clear enough to send Henry stumbling backward. He turned and bolted down the stairs, his tools forgotten, but the house seemed to stretch around him. The front door, so close just moments ago, receded into the distance no matter how fast he ran. The whispers started then, faint and indistinct at first, growing louder and more insistent. They seemed to seep from the walls, from the floor, from inside his own head. When he finally reached the door, it wouldn't budge. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices overlapping in agony. And then, silence. The door creaked open on its own, revealing not the evening sky, but the same hallway he had just fled. At its end, the door to the room with the mirror stood open, the flickering light spilling out brighter than before. He didn't want to go back, but his legs moved on their own. No matter how he fought, his body disobeyed, dragging him toward the room. The mirror was waiting. This time the reflection wasn't his. It was a woman, pale and gaunt, her hair hanging in damp strands over her face. She mouthed something he couldn't understand, but her eyes pleaded with him. Then her face twisted, her mouth opening impossibly wide, and she let out a piercing scream that shattered the glass. When Henry woke, he was outside, sprawled in the dirt beside his truck. The manor loomed silently behind him, its windows dark and unassuming. He didn't wait to question what had happened. He sped down the narrow road, leaving Foxglove Manor behind. Weeks later, his client called. "We sent another contractor to Foxglove," the man said. "He said he couldn't find any signs you were ever there. No tools, no notes, nothing." Henry didn't respond, but he knew the truth. He could still hear the whispers when the world grew too quiet, and every mirror he passed seemed to flicker, just for a moment, with that faint, unnatural light.
Story number 4.
In the town of Gravenhurst, there was a peculiar custom no one dared question. Every household kept a single unlit candle on the windowsill every night. The candles were never lit, no matter how dark the night or how fearful the storms. The tradition was an unspoken rule passed down through generations. "It's to keep them away," the elders would mutter when asked. No one could say who they were, but everyone obeyed. Allison was new to Gravenhurst. She'd rented a small house on the edge of town, eager for a change of scenery. The first night, she noticed the unlit candle sitting on her windowsill. She chuckled at the oddity and left it there, assuming it was a harmless tradition. The second night, she grew curious. She stopped by the local diner, where the waitress refilled her coffee cup with a trembling hand when Allison brought up the candles. "Don't ask about that," the woman whispered, glancing toward the window as if something might be watching. "Just don't light it, okay?" The tension in the room was palpable. The other patrons avoided her gaze, stirring their drinks and pretending not to listen. Allison felt a chill creep up her spine, but shrugged it off. That night, alone in her house, she stared at the candle. The storm outside was fierce, lightning illuminating the empty fields beyond her window. The power flickered, and the shadows in her living room seemed to stretch and twist. Out of curiosity, or perhaps defiance, she struck a match and lit the candle. The flame flickered weakly at first, then grew unnaturally tall and bright, casting eerie, shifting shadows across the walls. The storm outside seemed to hush, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Allison felt a deep, primal dread bloom in her chest. Then she saw it. The first shape appeared at the edge of her yard, just beyond the pool of light from her porch. It was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long, its head cocked at an odd angle. Another figure joined it, then another, until a dozen stood in the rain, motionless, their eyes fixed on her window. Allison's heart thundered in her chest as she stepped closer to the glass. The figures didn't move, but their presence was suffocating. She tried to rationalize it. They were just people, maybe neighbors playing a cruel prank. Then the candle's flame turned black. The figures began to shift, their heads twitching unnaturally, their limbs bending in ways that made Allison's stomach churn. One of them stepped forward, its foot landing soundlessly on the wet grass. Its head twisted toward the window, and though it had no face, Allison felt its gaze pierce through her. She stumbled back, knocking over the candle. The flame extinguished, plunging the room into darkness. The moment the light vanished, the pounding began. The front door, the windows, even the walls, fists slammed against every surface with inhuman speed and force. The sound was deafening, shaking the house to its foundation. Allison screamed, covering her ears, but it didn't stop. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence was worse. Trembling, Allison crawled to the window. The yard was empty, the storm gone. The candle lay on its side, its wax hardened in a dark puddle. The next morning, she packed her things and left Gravenhurst without looking back. She never told anyone what happened, but she heard whispers about her departure. The townsfolk spoke of an unlit candle found broken on the windowsill and of how the house remained abandoned ever since. No one would dare live there now. And on stormy nights, if you stand on the edge of town and look toward that house, you might see them. Dark figures standing in the yard, waiting, watching, and hoping for the flame to return.
Story number 5.
The old highway that ran through Hollow's Reach was seldom used, known as the Ghost Road by locals. It was a narrow, winding stretch of asphalt that disappeared into the forest, flanked by trees so dense they blotted out the moonlight. Travelers avoided it, not because of its condition, but because of the stories of people who never made it to the other side. Elliot didn't believe in ghost stories. He was a trucker on a tight schedule, and the detour around Hollow's Reach would cost him hours. With a glance at his map and a shrug, he decided to take the Ghost Road. Just a shortcut, he muttered, gripping the wheel as the forest closed in around him. The first few miles were uneventful. The headlights of his rig cut through the darkness, illuminating the road ahead. The radio crackled with static, but Elliot barely noticed. His mind focused on the delivery ahead. Then he saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the road, just within the beam of his headlights. It was a woman, pale and barefoot, wearing a tattered white dress that fluttered in a breeze he couldn't feel. She didn't move, didn't react as his truck rumbled closer. Elliot slowed, his stomach twisting. He rolled down his window slightly, calling out, "Hey, you okay?" The woman raised her head, and Elliot wished he hadn't asked. Her eyes were black pits, bottomless voids that seemed to draw the light from the world. Her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, too wide, showing teeth that didn't look human. Slamming the window shut, Elliot stomped on the gas. The truck roared forward, the figure disappearing in his rear-view mirror. His heart pounded, but he told himself it was a trick of the light, his tired mind playing games. Miles passed, and Elliot's breathing steadied. The road seemed endless, the same stretch of trees repeating over and over. His watch had stopped working, and the clock on his dashboard blinked erratically, unable to settle on a time. Then the woman appeared again, standing in the middle of the road this time. Elliot swerved, narrowly avoiding her, the truck's tires screeching. The rig shuddered to a halt, and he sat frozen, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. When he dared to look, she was gone. Elliot cursed under his breath, gripping the wheel tighter. He had to keep going. He didn't have time for this nonsense. The truck rumbled back to life, and he pressed onward, but the road felt different now. The air inside the cab grew colder, his breath fogging the windshield. Shadows flickered at the edge of his vision, but when he turned to look, there was nothing there. The radio burst to life suddenly, a distorted voice crackling through the static. "Turn back." Elliot's blood ran cold. The voice repeated, growing louder, angrier. "Turn back! Turn back!" He yanked the radio's power cord, silencing it, but the voice didn't stop. It was inside the cab now, whispering in his ear, filling the space with a suffocating presence. Then the headlights flickered and went out, plunging the road into darkness. The truck rolled to a stop, the engine dead. Silence enveloped him, thick and oppressive. Elliot grabbed his flashlight, stepping out into the night. The forest was eerily quiet, that no rustle of leaves, no chirp of crickets, just the sound of his own panicked breathing. As he moved toward the front of the truck, the beam of his flashlight caught something scrawled across the hood in what looked like blood. Too late. The whispering returned, louder now, surrounding him. He spun around, the flashlight catching glimpses of movement, figures darting between the trees, pale faces staring at him from the shadows. The woman stepped out of the darkness, her black eyes locking onto his. This time she wasn't alone. Dozens of figures followed, their hollow eyes and too wide smiles glowing faintly in the night. Elliot stumbled back, but there was nowhere to go. The forest had closed in, the trees impossibly close, their gnarled branches reaching for him. The last thing he saw was her smile as she stepped closer, the whispering crescendoing into a deafening roar. The truck was found days later, abandoned in the middle of the ghost road. The engine was intact, the tank full, but Elliot was never seen again. Locals say that if you drive the ghost road late at night, you can still hear the whispering warning you to turn back. But if you don't listen, you might see her standing in the road waiting for her next passenger.
Story number 6.
There was a hill on the outskirts of town that no one dared climb after dark. Locals called it Hollow Hill, though the name's origin was as mysterious as the hill itself. Children whispered about strange lights that danced at its peak and shadows that didn't belong. But the most chilling tale was of the Whisperer. It was said that if you stood at the base of the hill at midnight and listened carefully, you'd hear a soft voice calling your name. The voice would promise you things, secrets, power, or the answers to the deepest questions you'd ever asked yourself. But no one who climbed the hill after hearing the voice ever returned. Evelyn didn't believe in legends. She was a skeptic by nature, and Hollow Hill was just another piece of folklore meant to scare people. But when she moved into her grandmother's old house nearby, the stories came flooding back, revived by the warnings of her neighbors. "Don't go near it," one of them said, clutching a cross. "It's not just a story." Evelyn smiled politely but dismissed the warning. Curiosity gnawed at her until one night she decided to see the hill for herself. The night was quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. Armed with a flashlight, Evelyn walked the dirt path that led to Hollow Hill. The closer she got, the more oppressive the air became. The trees lining the path stood unnaturally still, their branches forming skeletal shapes against the night sky. At the base of the hill, she stopped, suddenly aware of how loud her breathing was. The flashlight flickered, its beam weak against the darkness. She stood there for several minutes, feeling foolish, until she heard it. A voice, faint and almost melodic, drifted on the wind. Evelyn. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. The voice was soft but distinct, as if someone were whispering directly into her ear. "Come closer. I've been waiting for you." Every instinct screamed for her to leave, but something about the voice rooted her in place. It wasn't threatening. It was inviting. Against her better judgment, she began to climb. The hill was steeper than it looked, the ground soft and unsteady beneath her feet. The voice grew louder, guiding her, though she couldn't see its source. As she ascended, the world below seemed to disappear. The trees, the town, even the stars above faded, leaving only the hill and the impenetrable darkness around it. At the top, she found a clearing bathed in an unnatural glow. In the center stood a figure. A man, or at least it looked like one. His features were blurred, as if she were seeing him through water. "Evelyn," he said again, his voice smooth and intoxicating. "You've come. Who are you?" she managed to ask, her voice trembling. "I am what you've been seeking," he replied. "I know your questions, your fears, your desires. I can give you what you want most." Evelyn didn't answer, but she thought of her mother who had died when she was just a child. She thought of the ache that had never faded, the longing to hear her voice again, to know she was at peace. The figure stepped closer, his form flickering like a shadow cast by an unseen flame. "I can bring her back," he said, his smile too wide, too sharp. "Just take my hand." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. The offer was everything she'd ever dreamed of. But as she reached out, her flashlight flickered again, casting light on the ground around her. There were bones, dozens of them, scattered and half-buried, their white surfaces gleaming in the eerie glow. The figure laughed softly, a sound that sent ice down her spine. "They all wanted something," he said, gesturing to the remains. "And they all got it, for a time." Evelyn yanked her hand back, stumbling away. The figure's smile faded, replaced by something darker, more menacing. "You can't leave now," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. The glow around him intensified, and the air grew heavy, suffocating. Evelyn turned and ran, the ground shifting beneath her as if the hill itself were alive. The voice chased her, no longer soft but a roar of anger and despair. When she reached the bottom, the night was still again. She didn't stop running until she reached her grandmother's house, slamming the door shut behind her. The next morning, she looked out the window toward Hollow Hill. The path was overgrown, as if it hadn't been walked in years, and the hill itself seemed smaller, less imposing. But that night, as she lay in bed, she heard it again. "Evelyn, I'm still here."
Story number 7.
There was an antique shop at the edge of town called Yesterday's Echo. It was a small, cluttered place filled with forgotten relics, creaking chairs, dusty mirrors, and clocks that hadn't ticked in decades. Among the locals, it was whispered that some of the items carried Attachments. Emma had just moved to town and wasn't one to believe in superstitions. She loved antiques, the idea of owning something with a history, so she found herself wandering into the shop one overcast afternoon. The owner was an old man with pale, watery eyes and a peculiar way of watching her, as though he was waiting for something. "Everything in here has a story," he said, his voice raspy. Emma was drawn to a small music box on one of the shelves. Its wood was dark and polished, the carvings intricate and almost hypnotic. She turned the tiny crank, and a haunting melody filled the shop, a tune that felt both familiar and wrong. "How much for this?" she asked, already picturing it on her mantle. The old man's expression flickered. For a moment it looked like he wanted to say something, but then he simply named a price. Emma paid and left, the music box tucked under her arm. That night, she placed the box on her mantle and gave the crank a few turns. The melody filled her living room, soft and eerie. It gave her goosebumps, but she brushed it off, chalking it up to the chill in the air. She fell asleep on the couch that night, the music box silent and still. At 3 a.m., she woke to the sound of the melody playing. Confused, she sat up, her heart pounding. The music box was open, its crank turning on its own. She moved toward it hesitantly, the hairs on her neck standing on end. As she reached to close it, the melody stopped abruptly, plunging the room into an unnatural silence. And then she heard it, a faint whisper coming from behind her. Emma spun around, but the room was empty. Shaking, she grabbed the box and shoved it into a drawer. Just an old mechanism acting up, she told herself. The next night, it happened again. This time, the whispers were louder. They weren't just behind her, they were all around her, circling, overlapping, too many voices speaking too quickly to understand. The box was still in the drawer, but the melody seeped out louder than before, filling the house. Emma felt a cold hand brush her shoulder, and when she turned, she saw a shadow in the corner of the room. It was tall, its form wavering like smoke, and its eyes, if they were eyes, were two pinpricks of glowing red. The whispers stopped, replaced by a single word, drawn out and distorted. "Mine." Emma screamed, grabbing the music box and throwing it out the window. The melody stopped as it hit the ground, shattering into pieces. She didn't sleep that night, her eyes fixed on the window, half expecting the shadow to return. By morning, the music box was gone. Emma tried to move on, but the melody stayed with her, faintly humming in the back of her mind no matter where she went. And at night, she started seeing shadows in the corners of her room, growing closer with each passing day. A week later, she went back to yesterday's echo. "I need to return this," she said, her voice shaking, though she held no music box. The old man gave her a sad smile. "Once it chooses you, there's no giving it back." Before she could protest, he gestured to the far corner of the shop. There, sitting on the shelf as though it had never left, was the music box. Its wood was polished, its carvings gleaming, and its crank was already turning. The haunting melody began to play.
Story number 8.
There was a legend about the old glassmaker's manor, a sprawling estate that had been abandoned for decades. People in the nearby town avoided it, not just because of its crumbling facade, but because of the stories. They said the glassmaker, Edward Morin, had been obsessed with his craft, creating windows so clear they seemed to erase the line between inside and out. But it wasn't just glass he was known for. Edward dabbled in strange experiments, whispering that he could trap light itself, or even souls, within his creations. One day, Edward vanished without a trace. The only clue was his workshop, sealed from the inside, with shards of glass scattered across the floor. Some pieces were said to reflect more than a person's face, reflections that moved when you didn't, or showed things that weren't there. Jessie, an urban explorer, thought the stories were ridiculous. She'd heard about the manor from a local blog and decided it would be her next adventure. Armed with a flashlight and a camera, she climbed through a broken window one foggy evening. Inside, the air was thick with dust, the furniture draped in rotting sheets. The grand chandelier in the entryway hung precariously, its glass crystals dull and lifeless. Jessie made her way to the workshop in the back, her boots crunching on shards of glass scattered across the floor. The workshop was exactly as described, an eerie room lined with unfinished projects. Framed panes of glass leaned against the walls, some shattered, others intact. Jessie raised her camera, snapping photos of the room, but when she reviewed the images, her breath caught. In every photo, her reflection was missing. A chill ran down her spine, but she dismissed it as a glitch. She turned her attention to the largest pane of glass, propped upright in the center of the room. Its surface shimmered faintly, as though it were alive. Jessie stepped closer, peering into it. The reflection it showed wasn't the room she stood in. It was brighter, cleaner, with sunlight streaming through the windows. But something was off. In the reflection, a man stood behind her. She spun around, but the workshop was empty. When she turned back to the glass, the man was closer, his face pale and thin, his eyes hollow. Jessie's heart raced as she stumbled backward, her flashlight flickering. The man in the reflection raised a hand, pressing it against the inside of the glass as if trying to push through. The pain began to hum, a low vibration that seemed to rattle her teeth. Jessie turned to run, but the door slammed shut, trapping her inside. The humming grew louder, and when she looked back, the man was gone from the glass. The reflection now showed her, but it wasn't her. The version of herself in the glass stood motionless, her eyes wide and terrified, pounding on the inside as though she were the one trapped. "No, no, no!" Jessie screamed, clawing at the door, but it wouldn't budge. A sharp pain shot through her hand. She looked down to see tiny cuts forming on her skin, bleeding thin lines that mirrored the cracks spreading across the largest pane of glass. Her reflection grinned. Jessie's scream echoed through the manor as the glass shattered, and the room went silent. When a group of explorers ventured into the manor weeks later, they found the workshop empty, except for a pristine, unbroken pane of glass. In it, they saw a reflection of the room, but in the corner, a figure stood frozen. It was a woman with a terrified expression, her hands pressed against the inside of the glass.
Story number 9.
Lena moved into the old duplex after her divorce, looking for a fresh start. The house was charming in its way, creaky wooden floors, a clawfoot bathtub, and windows that let in golden afternoon light. But from her first night, she heard it. Scratch. 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 It came from the walls, faint at first, like mice scurrying behind the plaster. She didn't think much of it. An old house like this was bound to have pests. She called an exterminator, who searched the entire house but found no signs of rodents. Could just be the pipes or settling wood, he said with a shrug. But the sound persisted, louder now, and always at night. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It seemed to follow her, moving from one wall to another, always behind her as she walked through the house. One night, the scratching came from inside her bedroom wall. She sat up in bed, heart pounding, staring at the spot where the sound was loudest. Then it stopped. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. For a long moment there was silence. Then faintly a voice whispered back, "Hello." Lena froze. The voice was thin and raspy, like dry leaves scraping together, and it came from the wall. She wanted to believe it was her imagination, but the whisper came again, louder this time. "Help me." She bolted out of the room, left sleeping on the couch with all the lights on. The next morning, she convinced herself it was a nightmare. Stress, she thought. The house was old and creepy, and her mind was playing tricks on her. But the following night, it happened again. The scratching, louder than ever, and the voice. "Help me, please." Lena couldn't ignore it anymore. She grabbed a hammer from the garage and approached the wall where the sound was coming from. Her hands shook as she struck the plaster, zest breaking through to the wooden lath beneath. The voice grew more frantic. "Yes! Keep going." The urgency in the voice sent chills down her spine, but she kept swinging. Pieces of plaster fell away, and then she saw it, a hole, dark and deep, leading into the wall. A hand reached out. It was thin and gray, the skin stretched tight over bones with nails that were impossibly long and blackened. Lena stumbled back, screaming, as the hand clawed at the edge of the hole, pulling itself forward. A face emerged next, gaunt and hollow, with eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. "Thank you," it croaked, dragging itself out of the wall. Its body was impossibly long, its limbs twisted at unnatural angles. Lena ran, but the creature was faster. It moved with a jerky, skittering gait, like a spider learning to walk. She slammed the door to her bedroom, shoving furniture in front of it, but the scratching returned, louder than ever, coming from every wall. The voice spoke again, no longer pleading but laughing, a low guttural sound that filled the room. "You let me out," it said. "Now there's nowhere to hide." The door burst open, and the last thing Lena saw was the creature's too wide grin as it lunged toward her. The next tenant moved in a month later, thrilled to find such a charming house at an unbelievable price. On her first night, she heard it. Scratch, scratch, scratch.
Story number 10.
The wind howled through the empty streets of Ashvale, carrying with it the faint scent of decay. Grace clutched her coat tighter, her footsteps echoing as she hurried toward her apartment. The streetlights flickered erratically, casting long, shifting shadows that seemed to creep closer when she wasn't looking. It was always like this in Asheville after dark. Something about the town made the night feel alive. Grace had moved to Asheville a month ago for work. The town was quiet, tucked away in the mountains, surrounded by dense forests that felt as though they were watching her. At first, she'd attributed her unease to city nerves, but then came the noises. Every night, just past midnight, she'd hear them. Faint whispers seeping through the walls, too quiet to make out words, but unmistakably human. She lived alone, and her nearest neighbors were a retired couple 3 apartments down. The first time she heard the whispers, she had searched her apartment with trembling hands, a flashlight and kitchen knife in tow. She found nothing, but the whispers returned, louder, more insistent. One night, unable to stand it any longer, she pressed her ear to the wall. The voices stopped immediately. A cold shiver ran down her spine as she realized she could feel a faint vibration, like someone gently tapping on the other side. But the apartment next door was empty. Grace's curiosity got the better of her. She asked her coworkers about the building. Most dismissed her concerns with vague shrugs, but one, a woman named Elise, gave her a peculiar look. "That place," Elise said, lowering her voice, "is old. The landlord doesn't tell you, but there have been disappearances. People move in, but they don't always move out." Grace laughed nervously, brushing it off as small-town superstition. But Elise grabbed her arm, her eyes wide and earnest. "Don't listen to them. If you hear the whispers, don't answer. And whatever you do, don't let them in." The words haunted her. That night, Grace sat in her living room, her laptop glowing faintly as she typed Asheville disappearances into the search bar. To her horror, dozens of articles popped up. Tenants vanishing without a trace, a few vague reports of odd noises, strange occurrences, and then nothing. No follow-ups, no investigations, just silence. The whispers came again that night, but this time they were accompanied by a faint knock on her front door. Grace froze. Her heart pounded as she tiptoed toward the door, peering through the peephole. No one was there. The knock came again, louder. The whispers swirled around her now, growing sharper, angrier. She backed away, clutching her phone, but when she tried to call for help, the screen flickered and died. The knocking turned into pounding. The walls seemed to shiver with the force of it. Grace grabbed her keys, determined to run, but as she reached the door, everything stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing against her ears like a physical weight. And then she heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible scratching sound from inside the apartment. Slowly, Grace turned around. The shadows in the corner of her living room shifted, twisting into shapes that shouldn't exist. Eyes glinted from the darkness, too many to belong to one person. A voice, smooth and cold, whispered from the shadows, "You let us in." The next morning, the landlord found Grace's apartment empty. Her belongings were still there, her keys on the counter, her phone on the floor, her coat draped over the chair. But Grace was gone. All that remained was a faint, unsettling whisper, lingering in the air, and by nightfall, it too was gone.